Okay, Shabbat Shalom and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning study, and I am most pleased that you've taken the time to join us on this day holy to Yehovah. Tomorrow afternoon, for those of you who are interested, we will be doing a live stream from this place, both on Facebook and YouTube, for a class on Yom Teruah. Yom Teruah, as it is called in the biblical text. It's a day of shouting, a day of making noise, popularly known as the Feast of Trumpets. But I'll be talking on that subject, and depending on who shows up, we'll have other activities. I'll post a link as to the exact timing of that. We've scheduled the time here from 4 to 8. So if you're within driving distance and you can join us in person here at the United Israel Center South in St. Francisville, you can show up at 4 o'clock and we'll be here for several hours. But we'll probably, my thinking is that we'll do the class sometime around 5 p.m. So I'll post that as we get closer, and you'll be notified. All you need to do is click on Facebook and or YouTube. If you're subscribed to those stations and channels, you'll be notified when we go live, and if the timing doesn't work for you, you can catch it later, because those will be archived on the appropriate channels, either our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. I did want to indicate that Yom Teruah, as you know, is the festival that begins on the first day of the 7th month. So according to the reckoning on the Jewish calendar, which I hope most of you have probably received those in the mail. If you haven't received them yet, go check your box today, because they should be there. It may take a little longer. I sent out a few to people who live on other continents, so those might take a little bit longer. But nonetheless, you should, by this point or very soon, have one of our handsome Jewish calendars. I sent those out this past week. Now, that's according to the Jewish reckoning. On the Jewish calendar, some of my dear friends are looking for the thin crescent moon to announce the arrival of the 7th month. If that is you, there's no need to look for it tomorrow. You'll probably see the moon, the thin sliver of the new crescent moon of the 7th biblical month, on Monday evening. So, but nonetheless, we are fast approaching the 7th month, the holy month, the month that kicks off all the fall festivals. We'll have the show begins, if you will, the celestial show begins, and that starts off with Yom Teruah. And then on the 10th day of the 7th month, as you know, it's Yom Kippur. We'll be also hosting an event that time as well and teaching on that subject. And then come the fall festival that everyone is so anxious to be part of, Sukkot, tabernacles, booths. That comes later in the month, and we'll be also teaching during that time. So I'm very excited. I love this time of year, and I hope that you can join us for those events. Last week on Sunday, many of you joined us for our Shofar Factory. It was a nice time. Very informative. It was interactive. We had Rabbi Mendel Rivkin from Chabad, New Orleans, showed up and presented what he called a shofar factory. He had a nice banner. He taught on various types of horns. What is considered okay to use for a shofar, what is not considered kosher. So we got a class. It was fun. We had lots of kids in here. He brought 4 of his. As he said, he only has 11 kids. So he only brought 4 of his kids. But it was fun. So they interacted with the children here. And it was just a great time had by all. The highlight of the program, I thought, was the shofar making itself. And the children each got to pick a raw ram's horn from a pile. They took it to their desk and they sanded it, and then they put a polyurethane coat on it and made those shofars. So I wanted to tell you this, full disclosure, after my grandkids left, they left their horns here so that they could dry. So the next morning I came in and wanted to give them a test, just to see, because I didn't get to blow them earlier. And so I picked up this one. Now, it didn't look this beautiful at the time. This one belonged, notice I said past tense, belonged to my grandson, Kalel. And he didn't do that great of a job on it, but when I picked it up and sounded it, it has the best sound of any shofar that I've ever blown. Now, I'm not going to show you now. This is for tomorrow. But I picked it up, and when I blew it, I thought, this is the one that's going to herald the coming of the Messiah. This horn right here. It's got to be. It's got a beautiful sound. It's deep. So I took it, and I worked on it. I cleaned it and sanded it down really nicely, and then did it myself. And I told my grandson that when I'm too old to blow this, or whenever he's strong enough to take it from me, he can have it. But until then, it's mine. So, but I love this shofar, and I jokingly posted on Facebook that every time I blow it, I run out and look for the Messiah to come. So far, the only person who's shown up is the lady who runs a business next to me, and we talked a little bit about why I kept blowing that horn. So, but we're okay. So anyway, I'll post a link for our live stream for the class on Yom Teruah, and then after we do the teaching, then whoever is here or wherever you are, we're going to begin to blow those shofars. So be ready. It's time. It's time to get ready. It is fast approaching. Now, last week, moving into the class now, last week I taught on Torah reading Ki Tavo, when you come into the land. And this particular class gave me an opportunity to share with you what I called the consequences of the covenant. And consequences. A lot of people talk about the blessings and the curses, and that is indeed, as I pointed out last week, it makes up 70% of the material of the 121 verses in Torah reading Ki Tavo deal with what are popularly known or commonly called the blessings and the curses. So I taught on that subject. That was the single strongest, most relevant point in last week's Torah portion. And so today is something totally different. As I move into today's class, I find it necessary to present some background material, some context, if you will. It's very important that I lay this groundwork because what I want to do is set the stage for what we find in the Torah portion today. Now, I'm going to cover something which I think is revelatory, at least for me it was. I say this quite often, that when I study the Torah, I love to quote in a prayerful fashion this passage from Psalm 119:18. In the Hebrew, it's Gal einai va'avita niflaot mitoratecha. Open my eyes, and I will look for wonderful things from your Torah. One of the most disappointing things that I find in our culture today is that people have lost a love, or they never had a love, for the text of the Torah. Because the Torah contains things that many people who associate themselves with a religious quest have failed to totally grasp. And because of that absence, because of the lack of a Torah foundation, their faith is lacking, I think, in many regards. So what I want to do is begin today's class in the book of Malachi. In the book of Malachi, I want you to go with me to Malachi chapter 3 and verse 22. Now, if you're in an English Bible, you'll open up to chapter 4 and verse 4 in the English. 4:4 in the English, 3:22 in the Hebrew Bible. And it simply says, "Remember the Torah of Moses my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel, both statutes and judgments. And I just want to take this point and I want to explore it. I want to talk about covenants today, but things that even many experienced teachers of covenants don't get. They don't see, they don't understand, and they don't fully explore because they lump things together. They conflate covenants. They make two covenants one, and so forth and so on. But what I want to talk to you today is about some covenants that are based in the Torah, and I want to show you some things that quite possibly even the experienced among us have not seen. So in this particular passage, one of the last prophetic words that we have in Scripture, we are reminded, or we're told to remember, the teaching of Moses that he commanded all Israel at Horeb. In other words, at the end of the biblical period, this charge to remember the Torah of Moses is clearly communicated. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I want to share with you some thoughts that are going to weave together into hopefully a very sensible teaching on covenant. All right, now the title of my class today is something that hints at what I'm going to get into. It's a phrase from the Torah portion today, and the class title is Not With You Alone. Not With You Alone. Towards the end of last week's Torah portion, as we worked all the way through the blessings and the curses, we basically conclude what most students of Scripture recognize to be the ending of a speech of Moses, which begins all the way back in Deuteronomy 5. So you'll recall that in Deuteronomy 5, Moses is recounting, remembering the Torah that he commanded all the children of Israel at Horeb. All right? So in Deuteronomy 5, he's looking back on the event that's described according to the Torah's narrative in Exodus chapter 19 and 20, primarily. All right? But I want to take us back further than Deuteronomy 5, just to give you some context. I want to let you know where we are, geographically where we are, because it has a relevance that a lot of people miss. So go with me this morning, please, to the book of Devarim, to the book of Deuteronomy, and I want to go to chapter 1, Deuteronomy chapter 1, to the very first verse, Deuteronomy 1, and I want to set the stage. Deuteronomy chapter 1, Devarim. Ele ha-devarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. It's talking, it says, these are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel. Now, we're just read in Malachi. Remember this teaching of Moses and so forth from that he spoke to all Israel. Now this is the narrator. These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan, in the wilderness, over against Suf, between Paran and Tophel and Lavan and Hatzerot and Dizahav. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. And it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spoke to the children of Israel, according to all that Jehovah had given him in commandment to them, after he had slain Sihon, the king of the Amorite, who dwelt in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who dwelt in Ashtaroth in Edrei, beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab. Moses began to declare or make plain this Torah. Now in Hebrew, it's HaTorah Hazot. So what the narrator is telling us in this particular passage is that Moses declared these things, and it gives us a geographical place. He tells us that Moses was on the other side of the Jordan, and he gets very, very specific with it. But generally, he tells us that it is in the land of Moab. So how far are we from Horeb? were an 11 days journey from Horeb. So they're a good distance from the place where they received the teaching. So they're 11 days from Horeb across the Jordan, and so they're not in Horeb. They're in the land of Moab. I want you to get this. It's going to have relevance to the class today. Now I want you to go with me to chapter 5 of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 1. Deuteronomy 5, beginning in verse 1. And it says, "And Moses called all Israel and said to them," by the way, this is a Shema Yisrael that a lot of people don't know. They're more familiar with Deuteronomy 6:4, but this is a Shema Yisrael too. So it says, "Moses called all Israel and said to them, Shema Yisrael, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ears this day, that you may learn and keep and do them." Notice the order of the verbs. I teach on this all the time. There is an order. "Jehovah our God made a covenant with us in Horeb." I want you to get who he's talking to. He's addressing all Israel that are alive at that day, and he says that Jehovah made a covenant with us, that group, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. "Jehovah talked with you face to face in the mountain out of the midst of the fire. And then I stood between Jehovah and you at that time to show you the word of Jehovah, for you were afraid by reason of the fire and went not up to the mountain," and so forth. The first thing I want to draw your attention to, make sure you see this, again, is the order of the verbs. Listen. He wants Israel. Shema, listen. What he's going to teach them, there's your learn, to be guardful to do. That order is consistent in Deuteronomy. Jehovah, it says, made a covenant with us in Horeb. Now, notice in this particular passage, it says, Lo et avutenu, not with our fathers. Now, this is something, if you underline things in your Bible, if you can carefully do it without, doing it sloppy or sloppily, underline, not with our fathers. So one of the things that I want to point out is that this covenant is something different. Let's just say that this covenant is not the same as the one that was made with the fathers. Now bear with me, because I know a lot of people might get nervous and they'll go, no, the covenant is the same. It's exactly the same. We have evidence in Genesis chapter 26 that Abraham kept the statutes and judgments in the Torah and so forth. And what they want to do is people want to believe, not based on a knowledge of the text, but based on their traditional beliefs, that the same Torah as it's given now all the way up into the modern day is the same exact covenant that was given all the way back, and it was passed through Shem, and you've heard the story. What I want to do is indicate to you that what happened at Horeb, what happened at Sinai, Deuteronomy refers to Sinai as Horeb, but what happened at Sinai / Horeb is a covenant that is not the one that was made with the fathers. And notice, he wants to be very specific here. He says, with us. Now, I've got in my notes because I want to draw out more emphatically what the text says. He says, not with our fathers, but then he says, with us, we, these, here, today, all of us alive. You see how specific he's being? He wants them to know this covenant is with this group right here, you. All right? Very, very specific. Then he goes through that covenant with them, those, there, then. All of them that are alive at that place at that time. He proceeds afterwards to cover the statutes and the judgment. All the statutes and the judgments that are relevant in this particular covenant. Now, Pay careful attention to the way that I say things in this class. Take good notes. John will take good notes for you, I'm sure. But you can take some notes as well. But I want you to pay attention because Deuteronomy, you know it's my favorite book of the Bible, Deuteronomy provides us in the following 25 chapters, from Deuteronomy chapter 5 all the way up into the present Torah reading, more than 100 laws. Hear me, I've counted them. More than 100 laws that we've not encountered in the Torah before this. Okay? It's very interesting. Now that has puzzled many biblical scholars and biblical students. Now you'll recall that Deuteronomy, the word Deuteronomy, the name known that we know the fifth book of the Torah by, Deuteronomy, comes to us not from the Hebrew, but from the Greek. Deuteronomion, second law, or a repetition of the law. That's what it came through the Greek and through the Latin and into the English because, now get this, it was, I believe, and most scholars believe, that this is a misnomer. See, because people begin to think about the book of Deuteronomy as sort of a repetition, maybe a copy of what we already know. You know, if you pick up Deuteronomy and you're like, oh, he's talking about what already happened. We already know this. We read Exodus, we read Leviticus. We know from Numbers that these things happen. So it's just it's sort of a rehashing. No. Don't think that. Deuteronomy is, I would argue, I think rather effectively, that it is the single most important book in all of ancient literature in the entirety of the world, and it's because of something very, very interesting. We'll get into that later. But today I want to stress this. Let me take this a little bit further. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 17. I'm going to show you where the misnomer came from. This is where people got the idea, believe it or not, this is where we believe that most of the people who came up with this idea of calling the fifth book of the Torah Deuteronomy, it comes from here, but it's wrong. All right, so in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20 is called the Torah of the king. It's the instruction for the one who would sit on the throne. You remember when it says, when you come to this place and you're going to ask for a king like the nations and so forth. And then it describes what the king's going to do. Notice one of the things he's got to do, verse 18. And it shall be, when he sits upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this Torah in a book out of that which is before the priests, the Levites, and it will be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Jehovah his God, to keep all the words of this Torah, HaTorah Hazot, and these statutes to do them. Now, see there, Deuteronomy is very consistent on this. Now, based on this particular wording where it says that he shall make for himself a copy of this Torah, in Hebrew it's et mishneh HaTorah Hazot. Now this phrase, HaTorah Hazot, this Torah, occurs many times. I've written on this on our blog, our United Israel blog, but it only occurs in Deuteronomy. Something very specific, this Torah. But that's not my class today. What I want to stress today is that Deuteronomy is more than just simply a copy or a repetition of what has come before. It's more than that. It's not just a copy. You're going to find things within Deuteronomy that are nowhere else. It contains more than what came, get this, from Horeb. It contains more than what came from Horeb. Now, if you're still with me, I want you to follow along as I present proof of what I just said. In fact, per Deuteronomy, this covenant that I'm talking about, that I'm leading into to teach today, could be thought of as a new covenant. Or if you prefer, if that makes you a little nervous, it shouldn't, but if it does, let's say another covenant. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 69. Now, if you're in an English Bible, go to 29:1. Deuteronomy 28:69 in the Hebrew Bible, 29:1 in the English. And what I want to tell you, I'm going to read this verse in a moment. It is set off by white spaces, which I teach on quite frequently. This draws it out. All right, so it's set off. It's preceded by a white space, and after this verse, there's another white space. Now, before this verse, the final curse is spoken. And you know what the final curse is? Get this. You'll go back to Egypt. After all that they've been through, after being rescued by the Creator from a nation stronger than them, this great and marvelous thing, as Moses calls it in Deuteronomy, this great thing, this salvation from Egypt, he tells them that the ultimate curse, you're going back. You're going right back where you started from. Before you were saved, before you were rescued, before you were redeemed. And then there's a white space, and then there is this verse. These are the words of the covenant, which Jehovah commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, listen, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. Now, what we are going to talk about today is this covenant. These are the words of the covenant which Jehovah commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. Did you get the word besides? So we have a covenant at Horeb. Now, hopefully I've made the point. Moses then reminds the children of Israel of this great salvation from Egypt. He talks about how he led them on the way and their shoes didn't wear out and so forth and so on, and all the way through. And that brings us to the Torah portion today called Nitzavim. Nitzavim indicates the standing ones. The standing ones. This happens to be my favorite Torah portion because it is in my favorite book of the Bible, my favorite book of all time, and it contains my favorite chapter. Years ago, James Tabor and I taught a class separately, but at a UI conference, and we talked about our favorite chapter of the Bible. And Deuteronomy 30 was the one that I chose. This particular Torah portion begins in Deuteronomy 21:9. And I want to cover some things from this particular portion that I see. Remember, here's the prayer. David, Psalm 119, Gal einai va'avita niflaut mitorateka. Open my eyes. Now that's what you're asking Hashem to do. It's what you're asking God to do. You open my eyes. Now you have a part in this too. And I will look for wonderful things from your Torah. So we're gonna do just that today. Now I have a question for you as we enter into the subject matter today, and that question is this: could these ancient words contain points that we have not noticed before? I know every time I open Scripture, especially when I pray this prayer and I really look closely, I do see things that I haven't noticed before, and that is what the subject of this class is about. So now if you're one who believes that you've seen it all, that you already have it all figured out, then that's great, but you may not see anything else. But if you're willing to look, I think we're going to see something here. So as I might kick this off, I might say something like, behold, I show you a mystery. I like that. So you can get ready for it. You get ready. I want to read verse 9 through 12, Deuteronomy chapter 29. Here we go. You stand this day, all of you, before Jehovah your God, your captains of your tribes, your elders, your officers, and all the men of Israel, your little ones, your wives, your stranger that is in your camp, from the hewer of your wood to the drawer of your water, that you should enter into the covenant of Jehovah your God and into his oath. Interesting word here, translated oath. It's only used about 5 times in the entire Hebrew Bible. Most often, it is translated curse. Do a study on it. Aleph Lamed Hey. His oath, which Jehovah your God makes with you this day, that he may establish you today for a people to himself, and that he may be to thee a God, as he said to thee, and as he has sworn to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Now, I want you to catch a couple of things. This is covenant language. He's telling the group in front of him, physically there, in that place, at that time, those there then, that they are about to enter into the covenant. And by entering into the covenant, they become his people, and he becomes their God. So I want to stress this. If you are not in the covenant, you can't be one of his people. Now somebody goes, well, what if I'm not an Israelite? Relax. Isaiah 56 talks about this. Other places in the Tanakh talk about this. It's if you are a stranger or a eunuch that attaches yourself to the covenant, you're in. But your relationship with God functions only through covenant relationship. Okay, so that's the point here. So do a search for yourself on this phrase, and I will be their God and they shall be my people. You'll be surprised at how many times that occurs. Now, I don't know of an example, maybe some of you do, where it says, and I'll be their God and they shall be my people. It's, the other way around, they'll be my people and I'll be their God. It's about entering into the relationship. When you enter into this covenant, he is your God, you're declaring him your God, and therefore you will be the people. Now, get this, get ready, pay attention. Up to this point, we have reviewed historically the covenant. We're talking about a covenant that happened after the Exodus, in the wilderness, and it's historical in nature. Like you read it and you go, oh yeah, I've read about that. I've heard about that. We've talked about sacred history. We've talked about covenants with ancient people, the people that were alive in the time of Moses. As Moses put it in chapter 5, us, we, these, here, today, all of us living, right? Very specific group. Those standing, the ones that were standing there. So I'm stressing this for a reason. There and then. We're talking about them. Okay. Something very important, however, is about to happen in the narrative. And few people notice this. I want you to listen carefully as I read verse 13. Neither with you only do I make this covenant and this oath, but with him that stands here, with us this day before Jehovah our God, and also with him that is not here with us this day. Okay. So he's talking to the group, there, then, them. And he says something interesting. But not with you, you alone, am I cutting HaTorah Hazot, this Torah. Remember this phrase, HaTorah Hazot, HaTorah Hazot. I'm writing an article on this now. It's a lot of research. It's only used in Deuteronomy. It's something very specific. But he's saying that HaTorah Hazot, this Torah, it's not just with those then, with them. He's saying it's a two-group thing. Those that are standing with us today in front of Yehovah there, but also with one who is not here with us today. Now, I want you to just let that sink in for a minute. Imagine if I told you, well, with the internet, it makes it a little more easy to understand. But if I'm talking to the group here and on the internet, and I said, look, I'm conveying this teaching not just with you here alive today, but with those who are not here today. You see, it gives it a continuity, something which indicates that it has furtherance beyond the now, okay? I believe that we're about to see a shift in the audience, those who are addressed in this particular portion. So here we go. It says, I'll get to it in just a moment. My understanding, to underscore this, is that at that time, in what follows, Moses begins to address not just those standing with him then. You know, in other words, he's not just talking to the them of his day, but he's addressing this other group. So I'm going to ask you as I read verse 15, who is you? Who is you in verse 15? This ought to be exciting for you. For you know how we have dwelt in the land of Egypt, and how we came through the nations which you passed by. And you have seen their abominations and their idols, wood and stone, silver and gold, which were among them. Now, here, it's natural for us to read through this quickly and say, well, he's talking to them, you know. He says, you, meaning the group there, you've seen all this. He says, we were in Egypt and we passed through. We saw it, and he said, you also passed through the nations and saw. So I want you to let that sink in. We're going to explore this. He is at least including in the addressee a group that is not with him at that day. Now, what follows is a warning that would come to pass and did come to pass. Where it ultimately talks about how they would be scattered and so forth. I want you to go down to verse 21. So that the generation to come of your children, now he's talking to the group there, that shall rise up after you, and the alien that shall come from a far land shall say, when they see the plagues of that land and the sickness which Jehovah has laid upon it, and that the whole land is brimstone and salt and burning, that it is not sown nor briars, nor does any grass grow on it, like the overthrow of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, which Jehovah overthrew in his anger and in his wrath, then all the nations shall say, why has Jehovah done this to this land? And he goes on and he gives an answer. Right? So listen to this, chapter 29, verse 24 through 27. Then the men will say, because they've forsaken the covenant of Jehovah Elohim of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt, for they went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods whom they knew not, and whom he had not given to them. And the anger of Jehovah burned against this land to bring upon it all the curses that are written in this book, and Jehovah rooted them out of their land in anger and in wrath and in great indignation, and cast them into another land as it is this day. Right? Now, I'm going to talk about this. As it is this day. Now, he's talking to people, please understand, that have not even gone into the land. And he's describing people looking at the destruction of the land post a time when it was inhabited by the children of Israel. And they're going to say, people are going to say, what happened to this place? Why does it look like it's been overthrown like Sodom and Gomorrah? And the answer that will be given is, well, they didn't follow the teaching. They forsook Jehovah. You ever read Mark Twain's assessment of what the land looked like? That was desolate, barren. You could go for days and not see anybody. See, that's like a real description. What the text is telling us, he's talking to a group that hasn't been into the land yet, and he's going, listen, when this happens, and you violate the covenant, and you're cast out, and many, many years from now, later generation will look at the... Listen, here's my point as I get into this. This is prophetic. This is looking beyond the desert in Moab. This is looking at a time which is to come. Now, when critical scholars read this particular passage and they see the phrase, as it is this day, they throw a flag. You know what I mean by that? They throw a flag. They say, well, that wasn't written at that time. You know why I know? Because a contemporary speaker wouldn't say that. As it is this day, that indicates like it's been destroyed and it's been like that for a long time. So critical scholarship looks at this and they say, here you go. Here's proof. It wasn't written in the time of Moses. It's written much later. Now, I want to answer a question for you that should solve that riddle in this case. This is not anachronistic language as it is understood. What this is a prophetic glimpse where Moses is showing us through the eyes of a later generation who they will say, as it is this day, right? This is my view. This is what I believe is going on in this particular passage. The people, this later generation is going to be speaking and is speaking in this text. In other words, those not there with them then. Now look at verse 28 in the Hebrew, chapter 29, 28, 29 in an English Bible. All right? The secret things belong to Jehovah our God, but those things which are revealed belong to us and to our children forever. And why would that be? That we may do all the words of this Torah. Now, this particular phrase, do all the words of, in Hebrew, occurs 4 times in the Torah, all in Hebrew. And we'll go through those more next week. That's part of something that's going to fit better into next week's class. But the idea is that the entirety of this Torah, HaTorah Hazot, all the words of. Moses is big in Deuteronomy on using that particular phrase. Okay, I believe that you're beginning to see now what I'm going to lay out. I'm going to read verse 1 of chapter 30 in Deuteronomy, and I want you to tell me, to whom is Moses speaking? All right, you've got 2 choices. This is a multiple choice test. Answer 1, he's speaking to the group there, then, them. That's question, answer number 1. He's either talking to that group, or he's talking to those who are not standing there alive at that time. He's talking to another group. Here we go. Chapter 30, verse 1. And it shall come to pass, when all these things are come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you shall call them to mind among all the nations into which Jehovah your God has driven you. Think about it. The people he's talking to there, then, they hadn't even gone into the land. And he says, it's going to come to pass when all these things happen to you, the blessing and the curse, and then notice he gives them a specific thought here. He said, when you, whoever he's talking to, when you're scattered among the nations, something's going to happen. You know what that something is? In the English, it says, when you, what is it, how does it put it? When you call them to mind. In the Hebrew, I've pointed this out many times, it says when you return to your heart. So a group, does that sound like it's talking about the group then, who aren't even gone into the land yet, or is he addressing the other group? I propose to you that he is not talking to the group there with him that day at that time, but he now is talking specifically to another group. All right? The group he's talking to will have had the blessings and the curses upon them. They will be scattered among the nations. They will return to their heart among the nations there. You see? Now look at verse 2. And you shall return to Jehovah your God, and shall listen to his voice according to all that I command you this day, you and your children, with all your heart, with all your soul. Now, I talked about this last week. Deuteronomy has this phrase, with all your heart, with all your soul. I'm not going to go through those again this week. You have to listen to last week's class to get the notes. But Deuteronomy 30 gives us 3 things that we're to do with all our heart and all our soul. This is the first in Deuteronomy chapter 30. You're going to return and obey or listen to the voice that I command you this day. You and your children with all your voice, with all your heart, with all your soul. Now notice the next. Then Jehovah your God will, the English says, turn your captivity, have compassion on you, and will return and gather you from among all the nations amongst whom Jehovah your God has scattered you. If you're outcast, be at the utmost parts of heaven, from there will Jehovah your God gather you. Not gather them, you see, gather you. And from there he will fetch you. And Jehovah your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he'll do you good and multiply you, and so forth. When it says he's going to bring back your captivity, Friedman, looking closely at the Hebrew, says that that is best translated as he will produce a coming back. He will produce a coming back. In other words, this return will be the work of heaven. Jehovah will produce this. And it says he, in context, this is Jehovah. Jehovah will return and gather you from all the people. Now, I notice a lot of people in the last couple of classes have said, well, what about the Davidic Messiah? You know, what about this? Like, I don't know these verses. I know these verses. I've taught classes on this. But this is talking specifically about, not about a Messiah coming back and gathering the remnant. It says Jehovah. And you could say, well, he's going to use the agency of a Messiah to do this. Well, let's just stick with this for right now. Verse 5 says, He will bring you back. Now remember in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16, it says the people at that time, they, then, them, that group was told, circumcise your own heart. Remember Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16. Deuteronomy 12 through 16 sort of gives us what does God require of you. And he tells them, go and sacrifice, circumcise your own heart. But he tells this group in verse 6, and Jehovah your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed to love Jehovah your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. I want to point out the subtlety. Deuteronomy 10:16, it's commanded in the Torah to circumcise your heart. But he's addressing a group who was not standing there at that time, who is among the nations, whose heart is not circumcised. Jeremiah has a little bit to say about that as well. This group, he's going to bring back, he's going to gather them and put them in the land that he had given their fathers. He is going to circumcise their hearts so that they can love him and serve him with all their heart and with all their soul. This is the work of heaven, right? This is a different covenant besides the covenant that he gave at Horeb. That's what the Bible says. All right. He says, you'll return and you'll listen to the voice of Jehovah, and then blessings follow, which is exactly what it says, that the enemies will be cursed, and the curses that were on this group will be placed on the enemies, and this group is coming back to the land, and they're going to be blessed and circumcised of heart, and so forth and so on. But it all begins, the redemption begins when we listen. Now, verses 11 through 14 says very clearly, it's not too difficult. This commandment, what commandment? This commandment, which I'm commanding you this day, it's not too hard for you. It's not too hard for you. Now think about what people say. The people say the commandments are too hard for you. You can't do it. You can't. No one can follow this commandment. The Torah it's impossible to follow is what they say. It's too difficult. It's too hard. We have to wait for someone from heaven to bring it to us, to show us how. It's beyond the sea. This is what people say. That someone has to go get it for us and bring it to us so that we can hear it and do it. But that's not what Torah says. Moses says in verse 11, for this commandment which I command you this day, it's not hidden from you. It's not too difficult for you. Neither is it far off. It's not in heaven. Lo b'shamayim. Lo b'shamayim. It's not in heaven. It's heavenly, but it's not in heaven. It's not in heaven that you should say, who will go up for us to heaven and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross over the sea for us and bring it to us that we can hear it and do it. The word is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you can do it. The idea is that God has placed this word in the mouth of a particular people. Now, we can't just draw near with our mouth. Hold your hand here and go to Isaiah 59. I often read this in this context. in Isaiah chapter 59. We're talking about covenant today. In Isaiah 59, verse 21, as for me, this is my covenant with them, says Jehovah. My spirit which is upon you, and my words which I've put in your mouth, shall not depart out of your mouth, nor out of the mouth of your seed, nor out of the mouth of your seed, says Jehovah, from henceforth and forever. Look, it's not enough. It's not enough just to have the word in your mouth. Not when we're talking about redemption. Look at chapter 29 of Isaiah, verse 13. Isaiah 29:13. And Jehovah said, since this people draw near with their mouth and with their lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear towards me is a commandment of men learned by rote. Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, a marvelous work and a wonder. Look, a lot of people have this stuff on their mouth, but they have made the traditions of men, could be brilliant men, could be wonderful teachers, knowledgeable in many, many ways, who can expound great things with their great wisdom. Let me tell you, hear me closely, the time of that wisdom, the prophets declare, will depart. The wisdom of the wise will disappear. It's going to require getting that word beyond just the mouth and into the heart. When our faith is based on a commandment of men learned by rote, it is apart from the work of God. And that's what the prophets say. That's what Jehovah says. It requires us to get on our face, call out to God, seek God while He is near. As we enter these fall holy days, I suggest that we all seek to draw near to God. Look, I don't want my religion to just be based on a mouthy repetition of words and phrases. I want my faith to be real. I want your faith to be real. The redemption begins when we listen. Moses tells us in Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 14, that the word is very near, it's in your mouth and in your heart to do it. If it's just in your mouth, you probably can't do it. All the naysayers probably are right. But if you get it in your heart, look at verse 15. Deuteronomy 30, verse 15. See, I've set before you this day life and good, death and evil, in that I command you this day to love Jehovah your God, to walk in His ways, to guard His commandments. You know what guard means? Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2, Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 1. Guard means don't add to or take away from. And let me tell you something about religion. It has done a great disservice because it champions the adding to and taking away from. The teachers have made it so difficult to keep Shabbat, for instance. Call it straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. Majoring on the minors. Made it so difficult for people that they truly can't keep it. But it goes back to the very first sin in the garden. The very first sin in the garden was adding to the Word of God. You've heard that. You know that. Doesn't matter why. People can say, well, I thought that it would be the right thing to do to make something around it to make it more difficult so people don't break it. Leave it alone. To guard His commandments, verse 16, and His statutes and His judgments, then you shall live and multiply, and Jehovah your God shall bless you in the land into which you go to possess it. But if your heart turn away, so that you will not hear, but shall be drawn away, and worship other gods and serve them, I announce to you this day that you shall surely perish. You shall not prolong your days upon the land whither thou passest over the Jordan to possess it. I call heaven and earth to witness this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that both you and your seed may live, that you may love Jehovah your God, and that you may listen to His voice, and that you may cleave to Him. For He is your life and the length of days, that you may dwell in the land which Jehovah swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give them. Listen, we live in exciting times. All over the world, hear me, all over the world, something very interesting is taking place. It's a phenomena that is new in many ways. 3 decades ago, there were few. 2 decades ago, there were a few more. A decade ago, there were many. Now, something's happening. There is an awakening going on within primarily Christian groups. They are beginning to be drawn towards God, Torah, and Israel. Who knows what God is doing? Now, I have ideas about what is the cause. I believe that this group which is awakening could very well be. You could argue, you could say, no, I don't believe it. But it could be exactly what God said. Now, God does say, Jeremiah 16:19, talking about, and among the nations there will be people who say, our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit. Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23 says that in that day, 10 men from all the languages of the nations will grab the corner of the garment of him that's a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we've heard that God is with you. So there are people who are latching onto the covenant they could be descendants of Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, whatever. Could happen. I got news for you. Do you know that the group that was at the base of Sinai, you know that was a mixed multitude involved in that too? What do you think happened when God spoke to that group? Do you think that people next to him said, that doesn't apply to you? Don't do that. Put your hands over your ears. He's talking to me. Don't do that. No. That's it. Excuse me, Lord. There are Gentiles among us. Remember the Egyptians? I'm trying to make a point. The Bible's very clear. Ultimately, you know what the purpose of Israel is? To teach the nations, to be a light to the nation, a covenant of the peoples. You know that there are people who actually tell non-Jews who want to find God, who want to attach to the covenant, they have people that tell them, don't keep Shabbat. That's for us. You're like, come on. I mean, is that really what this message is? Or is the message that is global, is the message to go forth that ultimately Jehovah will be known from sea to shining sea? His name will be declared great among the nations. You know that people will travel to Israel in that time to keep Sukkot, to worship Jehovah, or they don't get rain? Nations will send delegates to keep Sukkot. Now, what if that's not one of the laws that they're supposed to keep? What if somebody said, well, I would go, but someone told me that I'm not supposed to do that? Look, Isaiah 56 talks about this pretty plainly. It's very, very important that we get this. You know, in Isaiah chapter 44, verses 1 through 5, Jehovah, speaking through Isaiah, talks about a time when He would pour out His Spirit among the nations, basically, and they, who's they, would spring forth. And you know what they say, these scattered ones? They begin to say things like, I'm Israel. Now, there are other people who go, you can't say that, you're not Israel. We know who Israel is and it's not you. It just says in Isaiah 44, verses 1 through 5, that this is going to happen. Do you know that according to Hosea, Hosea marries a prostitute named Gomer. He's told to do this, and they have children. The children have interesting names. The first one is Jezreel. It means God will scatter. The second child is called Lo Ruchama, no mercy. The third child is called, get this, Lo Ami, not my people. So we're talking about an illustrative lesson that was lived out, enacted on by a prophet to teach a lesson. God wanted Hosea to live this in his life to illustrate a point, that the northern kingdom had violated God's ways, and listen to what happens to them. They're going to be scattered. You know that Zechariah says this. He says they will be sifted through all, Amos says this, they will be sifted through all nations as corn is sifted through a sieve, yet not the least grain will fall to the ground. My eyes are on all their ways, and so forth. This group would be sifted through the nations. God will scatter. This group will have no mercy. Hosea says that he will have mercy on the house of Judah, but not on the house of Israel. The house of Israel, the northern kingdom, will receive lo ruchama, no mercy. They will ultimately be lo ami, not my people. But there's good news. There's good news. Because where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said, B'nai El Chai, children of the living God. God's going to do a work. When He wakes this group up, as they begin to come to themselves, when they return to their heart among the nations into which they've been scattered, if it's at the utmost ends of the earth, from there, Jehovah will bring them back. Now, this is going to be an unorthodox group, I believe. The prophet Zechariah in chapter 10 says, they will remember me in far-off countries. This indicates that they had forgotten Him. They had become lo ami. But something happens. You see, Moses is talking to a group there then, them. And what he says is that I'm not with you alone am I making this covenant. Not just with you who are standing here with me today, we, us, alive today, here, but with those not here today with us alive. Now, perhaps this group of responding ones, this group who have forsaken idolatry and their former pagan ways, perhaps this group is not the group that the prophets speak of. Perhaps it's just a bunch of Hittites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Jebusites, whatever, that are oriented towards the Hebrew Bible. And that's fine, because God is opening the door. It always has. He always has opened the door to any who attach themselves to the covenant. So I don't know. I mean, you could say, well, how can you prove it? I can't prove. But I could put that same question to a lot of things. How can you prove this? How can you prove that? How can you prove this? But I know this. Perhaps the group who is coming to themselves is who the Bible said would come to themselves. Perhaps the group which is turned to Jehovah to seek His ways, to find His face among the nations where they're scattered, perhaps it is a group that was scattered there and they're returning to the covenant of their fathers. Perhaps not. Perhaps it's another group that God didn't speak about. Perhaps you are returning to your hearts among the nations. Again, if you're not, there's still a place. Isaiah 56 is probably one of the greatest. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. But if the real group will be among the nations as Jezreel, Lo Rukama, and Lo Ami, at some point, people who are now known as Lo Ami will be called Ami. Now, even if I shelf those views and take the standard view, do you know that in Isaiah 19 that Egypt and Assyria are referred to as God's people? Do you know that in Malachi, at the end, it talks about those who think often on the name and who associate one with another around the name of God, that there will be those from among them who are made part of the Segulah, the very special treasure. You know, in Isaiah 56, it talks about some who, you can read it for yourself in context and see who is it that he says they will have a place better than sons and daughters. But look, none of this matters if we don't attach to the covenant. So either way, whichever way you choose to believe, I want you to think about this. I put before you this day life and blessing, death and cursing. Choose life. Choose life. Shabbat shalom. So we'll take a couple of minutes and we'll come back for a dialogue.